Thank you very much. I'll try and get to share screen now and hope that then works. That looks to be working from my point of view. I hope that's
excellent.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for having me along. It's been a long time since I last talked to this group. It's been nearly 3 decades. And as a historian, I'm always honored to be called in to talk about, talk to archaeologists and engage with theory within an archaeological setting. So what I'm going to do today is actually present something which is very much a think piece. It's very much something I'm thinking about, something I'm really trying to understand. So I don't really so much have answers as problems, but given the remit of this group, I thought it was suitable for this sort of occasion. So the introduction for it. So a few years ago, I gave a sort of paper in passing. Greg Wolf asked me if I would give a paper on gendering Roman imperialism, and it was tangential, I suppose, to my research interest, but I agreed on to do that. And what I was really interested in engaging with was gender as a power structure. And it seems to me that gender is particularly important because gender as power structures is in their very cells. My internet connection is unstable, but I hope it will not be unstable for too long. And so I went and published that paper, and I'm relatively happy about it, but I thought it missed some of the core elements. And recently, I saw a call for a conference, and it referenced this collection, and it said, well, these papers, they're still about the elite. They're only about they are only about the elite. And as you do when you look at these things, you think, oh well, God, it's lovely. What else do you expect me to write about? Is that actually true? Because I was trying to get beyond the elite. I came to the conclusion it probably was right, that really I was talking about the elite, and somehow I hadn't got to those power structures nearest in. And so this gives me an opportunity to think about how we might work from gender to actually thinking about the lives of individuals within the Roman Empire. So my problem is really how to think of gender in their own provinces with non-elites. And how to set gender within communities, how to get down to what's happening in the provinces, away from elite groups, away from the main cities, and think about a process of gender engagement in those sorts of communities. Part of my agenda in this talk is to focus on those who present themselves as women. I will be sort of convenience in trying to talk of a particular group. I could talk about other sorts of groups, but those who present themselves as women gives a reasonable body of data from which to work from. I'm going to be talking about the theory of sex and gender. I'm going to take a broadly materialist view and get closer to quotations from Marx and Marxists in this paper than I do in most things. And I'm going to be talking about environments of sex. And sex will be redefined in the context of this paper. I don't quite want to defend it quite yet. But I see sex as a variable human characteristic, and gender instead as a social code. But gender is engaged with sex, and sex is potentially resistant to gender. Gender itself, I see as constructed within specific ideological and sociological circumstances, um, uh, and sex as manifested in particular environmental circumstances. Gender is constructed on the body and is an intimate imposition of power, but sex and gender nearly always manifest themselves in local circumstances, in local ways. So that's my agenda, that's my kind of theoretical positioning. What can we do with those perspectives when we start to think about archaeology? What can we do with this theory? So what I'm going to take us through here is a progression of really four very uneven sections. The first bit will think about theory, about gender and sex. The second bit will concentrate on gender narratives, think about imperial and local. I'm going to argue that this is not a binary divide, that these two fields integrate. I'm going to then more or less conclude with considering household communities in Roman provinces and how they relate to issues of sex and gender. And we will be engaged with this lady on your screen on the right as we develop the argument. So, gender and sex. If one starts reading around gender and sexuality, one is inevitably drawn into Judith Butler's work and into Michel Foucault for all the problems and influences. For issues of gender, this is where I started my engagements. And Judith Butler in Gender Trouble tells us there cannot be a sexuality which is free of before or after the law, but it is always inscribed in power. Gender for Butler is a discourse, and that follows on from really the work of Foucault and is developed from Foucault's perceptions of the history of sexuality. When Foucault wrote that work, gender was seen, or his description of gender as discourse was seen as liberatory. And to get some idea of the impact of that, one would have to read things like David Halperin's Saint Foucault towards a gay geography. The implications of gender and discourse are profound. We know, or according to Foucault's analysis, discourse is wrapped up in certain sorts of power dynamics. And it's the power dynamics that determine discourse. What follows from that, if we see gender, sexuality, and Foucault doesn't use the word gender, he uses the word sexuality, but he means really quite similar to what Butler means when Butler writes about gender. It means that there's no natural, essential gender sexuality. Butler shows quite clearly that there's no particular reason for gender, these small physiological differences, to be a social organizational principle. And Butler asks the key question, which I think is really important politically, as to who decides and on what grounds certain physiological differences are socially significant and why others are not. So why skin color is seen by many as sociologically as socially significant, why gender is seen as sociologically significant, but the color of one's eyes are not. Foucault's sexuality as discourse is a work of history, and what Foucault does is he maps the gradual shifts in discourse at the time. Many people will be familiar with that. And if sexuality shifts over time in its formulations, it means that there is no essential sexuality. Freud is entirely wrong in seeing asexuality, which is a temporal and a cultural. And sexuality, however determined, does not necessarily determine identity, and that's part of an attack on the 18th, 19th, and of the 20th century perceptions of sexual sexual practices as being representative of certain sorts of personality types. If one reads Foucault, and indeed if one reads Butler, one is caught up in a discussion of sexuality and sexual belief. And in the reception of Foucault, it's very obvious and problematic that what he's talking about is talking and writing, and that is really very different from experience. And for Foucault, sexuality is not sex. Sexuality is the discussion of sex. This has many implications and problems. Gender and discourse is a social convention. Understanding this really should be liberatory. There's no kind of rules out there. We should stop telling people what to do and make any association between sexual behaviors and identity. And then there should be flexibility in social engagements with gender. What that would seem to suggest in the 1970s, late 1970s and 1980s, when this was being discussed and this was coming out, was that eventually issues of gender, the importance of gender, would gradually disappear. And that gender would become something like social clothing, which you could adopt at will, almost as a game. So you could adopt a gendered personality, which would no one would really care about terribly much. And that was the perception in Foucault's What is Enlightenment? One might adopt a close of modernity in the creation of the self. And we may adopt various roles depending on what we willed or what we wanted to do. What's been rather interesting is that that is not the way things have gone, and that gender remains a fundamental principle about how we organize our society, and it also remains a fundamental principle about how the self is considered. Gender is an issue of personal and social importance. It has not disappeared. Sex, which as a working definition, I might see as the physiological manifestation interaction of the broadly dimorphic characteristics of humans, is something very, very different. In Foucault's history of sexuality, the problem was not not people wrote about sex. According to the reception of this, the problem was not of what people wrote, but what people did. People were confused that Foucault didn't talk about what people did. And that led to a consideration of critique that he was not taking into account those who were not talking, and indeed those whose positions and power structures were lesser. What about those people who were not engaged in Greek philosophical discourse? And that's a slightly parallel route and partly a reactive route. Julia Kristeva and the French feminists were at the same time engaging more closely with the bodily, especially the female body, and the psychological, and trying to move away from a psychology which was male-dominated and saw the masculine and the male as the norm, and think about what a French embodied feminist psychology might mean. Sex seems to matter in this viewpoint, and indeed the body seems to matter. If we start thinking about gender and diversity, and we start thinking of gender as a social code, we can explore the spread of gender representations across cultural zones. And these can be imperial zones and networks of imperial communication. And that's essentially what I did in the article that came out last year and was written a few years prior to that. And yet, as I note, the gender seems limited. You can have gender and intersectionality. You can try and deal with gender according to others' kind of social categories as well, class, race, culture, etc. But what about sex? The relationship between gender and sex is problematic. Sexual behaviors seem multiple within gendered categories, and gender seems unable to decide, explain, or predict sex. What happens then if we put the body back into the analysis? What happens if we start to think about the materiality of sex? and indeed identity. And that's what the material feminists have been engaging in. Elizabeth Gross, who is perhaps the leading figure in this area, in her Space-Time Inversion, an introduction to that, talks about the unsettling effects that rethinking bodies implies for those knowledges that have devoted so much conscious and unconscious efforts to sweeping away all traces of specificity, the corporeality of their own processes of production and self-representation. The body, then, is seen as a rejection of the discourse. The body is seen as somehow counter to that discourse. And the body is the material point of human existence. And that connects philosophically to Heidegger and many other philosophers in emphasizing that we are not just thinking individuals or cultural individuals, we exist in space and time, and in a specific space and time. And that as animals, the human animal, we are produced and reproduced in our physical and natural environments as beings. Further, our self-representation and our self-understanding is so often physical, and it is hence specific to time and place, that we exist not just in discourse, but we exist in reality and in material social relation. Rosie Braidotti takes this further and sees this as a form of ontology. Sexuality is less as a mechanism of social control than a generative ontological force pertaining to the virtual vital chaos, which is not chaotic, but the boundless space of virtual possibilities for pleasure-prone affirmative relations. Sexuality is both post, it's constructed after, and before identity. It's a constitutive force that is always already present and hence prior to gender. Sexuality is about our being as animals within a particular environment. It situates us in social relationships. It is constitutive, not as a type, it's actually prior to gender, but as a way of being. And it's fundamental to our fundamental social interactions and our being. And it's thus a materiality in which gender is constructed. So sexuality comes first, sexuality in its diversity, and gender comes second. That's not a conservative return to a crude gender binary, and certainly not to a form of biological determinism. Again, back to Elizabeth Gross and her work on Darwin and feminism, which didn't really seem to be a natural alliance. In that article, she uses the phrase 1,000 tiny sexes. Now, I was rather impressed that Kemi Badenoch, who's not someone you'd think would be reading feminist discourse, poured scorn on this idea, which at least meant that, well, in the first place, that she'd come across it somewhere, and as far as I'm concerned, in the second place, I must be on the right track in thinking that this is a possible way forward. Elizabeth Gross argues that sexuality manifests in multiple ways. It is highly individualized, as we are, as humans, are highly individualized. And the link to Darwin is that sexuality is an evolutionary point of difference. In that essence, binaries are nonsense. In a more cultural framework, Audre Lorde, in a brilliant little contribution, The Master's Tools, argued in The Poetic that the master's categorization, so if we use simply the categorizations and the ways in which the master hegemonic discourse has constructed identities around gender, around anything else, around race, we will never dismantle the master's house. It will always remain the same. We have to think in different modes of analytical and practical engagement, and indeed in community invention. This takes us further than intersectionality. Intersectionality can be a further layering of category on category, making people both and, to an acceptance of fundamental variation, but not variation from a norm, because there is no norm. It means, I think it's scattergraph, if one can put in categories of multiple different types of sexuality and sexual behavior. And that's certainly how I think of it personally, as a man of a certain age, and identifying as male, and growing up with those categorizations. It's always baffled me that my sexuality, my sexual being seems to be so very different from lots of other people who identify themselves as men, as straight, etc., etc. That there isn't a norm, there is just multiple variation. And that takes us back to gender. So if you've got sexuality doing lots and lots of different things, what is gender? Karen Barad writes that performativity is a contestation of the excessive power granted to language for what is real. So what we do, how we behave, works against language. Works against language. Somehow we have to get beyond language in order to deal with questions of ontology and materiality. In traditional philosophy, language is given primacy and determined meaning, but we all know that the inadequacy of language in representing the real. In actual fact, language is a sophisticated means of social coding, whereas our performances, acts, our being, make material social relations. Gender is seen as resting in language. It's resting in philosophical terms, in the symbolic, in the phenomenological. But sex and sexuality exist in the world, dasein, in multiplicity. Gender becomes the aesthetics by which we control and simplify our experience, our gendered experience of the world, and possibly works as a comprehensive system ideology. So we've got this chaotic sexuality, which is brought into some sort of order by gender as an act of power. And back to sex. For me, sex is a fundamental part of the generative function of humanity. And in that sense, it's ecological, and it must be engaged in environmental factors. It's engaged in the varying environmental factors which govern reproductivity, but it's also part of a set of social relationships. So when we think about sex and reproductivity, we should think about sex as a form of social reproduction, social relationships, as well as being biologically reproductive. That reproduction happens within close-knit environments which provide those material circumstances for reproduction, communities and households. And sex can only be expressed within those specific social settings and relationships. Gender crosses over those sorts of boundaries. So what I end up with is a really quite complicated model, sort of cluster of values around body, which are all somehow interacted. So we have sex and gender, we have ecology, we talk about it as environment, reproduction and households, all of which are working on the body. That's sort of where I end up in my theoretical discourse. And that leads us to sort of a preliminary set of conclusions. First of all, what we are doing is we're talking about a body politics. In that body politics, we have a multiplicity of sex, and that sex is related to a material existence. It's an existence in the world. That sex is reproduction, which is social and biological, and happens with specific bodies, in specific places, in specific social relations. Gender, however, is a social and political narrative. It's a representation. And that organizes and tends to simplify the chaotic elements of social and sexual life. It's stories by which we try and understand the chaos that is around us. And it allows the imposition of narratives and discourses. Now, those narratives and discourses may emerge from outside the locality, and I think that's what I've previously shown, that those narratives and discourse can emerge from an imperial level. We might think of those as gender ideologies. We might think of them as kind of organized and theoretically thought through understandings of gender, as we see in the Augustan period and as we see in many modern instances. Those gender narratives, the gender ideologies, those organizational principles are recognized as being often as being in bad faith with the subject, since the subjects are multiply varied in sex. So if you have a gender ideology which declares someone to be a homosexual, the person who is declared a homosexual in that gender ideology, using old-fashioned terminology here, is likely to say, but that doesn't represent me fully. This is not me. I'm much more multiple than that. I don't like the label. The label is demeaning of my variety and my individuality. The complexity of this model, which I'm talking about the kind of cluster of values, allows a certain scope for social agency. Nothing is determined, and there is an interplay of those various elements. Gender is an everyday social representation. It's not something that is just generated from outside. It is generated in the performance of an everyday community, on an everyday basis, in everyday relationships, within the reproductive and sexual constructs of a household, a community, a relationship, or an ecology, however we might like to put it. Gender is therefore constructed in everyday and intimate performance. That performance is secondary to sex, engaged with ecology, which is engaged with ecology, reproduction, and the household. And performance of gender is always highly localized, even if it might draw on the imperial, or we might think of the imperial in a modern context. That then ends the theoretical discourse, and then we can move on, I think, to think about how gender narratives might work. What we can see, and this is the second half is going to be much shorter, is that there is a really quite close interaction between imperial ideologies, gender narratives that connect gender to sex. Perhaps the most obvious and hackneyed way of doing this is by showing the telespheres from the Areopagus, where fertility, sex, gender are interrelated. The imperial narrative seeks an imposition upon the individual, and that relies upon the development of models, the replication and adoption of those models. And these are easy to see in an imperial context. We can see it with Messalina, mother and wife, where fertility and gender and sexuality and sex are intimately connected through reproduction. We can see it in the replication of imagery of women specifically, which kicks off on a major scale with Rome, with the multiple Libyas that we find distributed across the Roman Empire. We can see the adoption of the discourse in statuary like Eumarchia in Pompeii, spreading out from beyond the imperial family, and how that provides her with a gendered role in community leadership. And one of my favorite Livia depictions, if this really is Livia, and I would leave it to the art historians, is in the everyday use of a lamp, which is from the British Museum. But this also happens locally, and we can see that in materials such as the Fayum portraits, sometimes called the mummy portraits. These portraits, correctly spelled, emerge from around about CE and are clearly local representations. They're locally painted, they're locally made, And what we could do with these is we could search for originary cultural elements. Is this Egyptian? Is this Roman? But the real question is why one would want to do that. We could find that there's clear Egyptian elements within the religious context and sometimes religious symbolism, which appears uh, within the portraits themselves, and Roman elements in fashion and style. And in particular, for this lady, we'll be talking about her earrings with those three lovely pearls. But these local and imperial elements are not in oppositional or binary relations. So people are not saying I'm Roman or Egyptian in this material. They're constructing a gender image which draws on various elements of gender ideologies which appear in the local context. Whatever she is doing, and let us assume she has agency for this picture, she is doing it within conjunction of the gender ideologies which are available to her, which may be multiple, and she may choose to use in whatever means she wishes. These images reflect a localized construction of gender. They must make sense in a local environment. They are probably circulating before not circulating, they're probably painted before the death of the individuals concerned, and then they are part of the funeral rituals. It therefore has a local community basis, and the gender discourse must have significance within that local environment, but also in terms of the individual and how the individual wants themselves or is represented. All these images are images of gender. All representations are discourses, and are thus products of a gender ideology. So what we're seeing here is gender rather than anything that we describe as sexuality. And that leaves the problem. What can we do with these items, this material, in an intersection, or trying to understand an intersection with the multiplicity and materiality of sex? So how do we find sexual diversity in the archaeology? How do we get to the individual and the individual's engagement? Our problem then, the material we have is mostly representational and cultural. Can we get beyond gender? When people talk about the 1,000 tiny sexes, it's always ethnographic and experiential. So I might say that these images have behind them 1,000 tiny sexes. They might have a variation of ethnographic and experiential engagements with sexuality and the plurality of sexuality. But you'd have to take me on trust because I can't actually provide the evidence for it. It becomes an issue of faith and theory, and if you were hostile to it, you would say just an ideology that I'm imposing on the ancient world because of my own strange readings. The solution to this, I think, for our purposes and purposes of historians working within a kind of material culture, is to think about the localized construction of the body or the image of the individual, and that the individual has to exist and the gender has to be constructed within local specified environments. Those local specific locations and their ecologies should have traces in the representations of gender. So if we go back to my cluster that I was talking about earlier, these things are all intimately related. So ecology, sex, gender, connect. So what the images provide are fragments of lives. They provide gender which should have some representation of those fragments of lives. But to get there, we have to think in a different ecological frame, an analytical frame. And that's where I'm going to move now to the issue of household communities. Well, what we know is that there is significant variation in household representation across the Roman world and by social class. And there's just masses of images which show different ways in which households and couples are displayed and discussed. And you can trace them across regions, you can trace them across time, you can trace them across social classes, but it's all very different. But what they are representing in some way or form is a household or relationship. And we get epigraphic variation. Epigraphic variation in which different groups produce different patterns of attestation, different ways in which families, individuals appear within the record. This inscription on the right is an inscription of the Roman soldier, and it's from Cologne. I thank my student Harry Triggs for discussing this with me. And this is Bibius and his family from Cologne. And what's really interesting about Bibius is that he doesn't choose to depict himself as a Roman soldier or as a veteran or in any of these ways, although that appears on the text. He chooses to depict his household, his family, his reproductive unit. And that's really rather different from what you get in most other military communities across the Roman West. And in the 70s, Sawat and Shaw showed that there was statistically significant variation between provinces, and said that number of women who were being attested on funeral inscriptions, and there was variation by community and possibly by other sociological factors. And what that tells us is considerable differences in how customs construct themselves, how they operate, how they represent themselves, and how they are constructed. And we move on to household, sex, and gender. I think that'd be just about okay for time. Okay, so what do we think about households? I use households as the primary economic, productive, reproductive, and consuming unit within an ancient society. And what's different about humans is that humans have considerable capacity to remodel the environment. And that means that ecologies, the ecologies in which reproduction and activity takes place, are always social, they're always communitarian. There's now, not at least from very early in human history, there is no ecology which is not human, and the Anthropocene has a massive effect on how ecologies are constructed. So the household is the primary socialized location in which sex is manifested and gender explored and sometimes represented. But what we know about the ancient world, and this is really not very surprising, is that households are structured in very different ways in different socio-economic environments. So in Roman Egypt and Roman Syria, we see that there are large households which are structured to exploit particular economic niches and meet particular economic needs. And these households are the means of production, but also the means of reproduction. The materiality of sex then would seem to relate to these households and to these means of social economic production and reproduction within the household. Gender represents those ideologies and represents the ideologies that must relate to the means of production or the means of reproduction. Gender cannot be unaffected by those household means of production dynamics. What does that matter? When it comes to reading this woman and her representation, we have to think about her within a specific social context to the extent that we can understand her. From the papyrological record, we know that women were central to the household operations. Even if the household operations turned around property, it turned around men's work, it's the women who seem to be at the center of archives and often of the family or of the units which inhabit houses. The fine portraits seem to come from an urban community and are likely reflective of medium to high status women in a regional center. And what's very obvious here is what she's doing. She's displaying her wealth. You see that in the earrings, as I've already mentioned, in the heavy gold necklaces that we see in so many female portraits with a big chain and the jewel in the center. The jewel necklaces around her neck, the elaborate hair, the very wonderful pin at the top, the golden hair chain, I don't quite know what to call that. I've not done enough hairdressing courses, and the beads which seem to be inset into her hair, and then also in the clothing. But it's also a display of self, it's a display of identity, it's a display of who she is, a display of her individuality. In that sense, it's also a representation of sex, in the broad sense of the word sex here, in the productive social role of this woman in this social context. It's a display of gender, which is being manufactured in a specific context and for this specific woman. Clearly, there are ideologies of gender that are present here. Clearly, there are ways in which a woman should be or a woman is thought to be. And maybe those ideologies might stretch as far as the empire in terms of fashion. But are these determining of the way in which she wishes to be presented or the way in which she is presented? Or are these manipulated? What we see here is manufactured within a particular pattern of social interactions and relationships. And it's that particular pattern of social interactions and relationships which make up the ecology, the environment of the house. Since no household can exist by itself and has to be integrated within its society in terms of networks of knowledge, power, and wealth, her portrayal must have drawn the material and real effects from those engagements. What we're seeing here is something that is profoundly social, profoundly economic, and is also profoundly individual. I don't have conclusions, but I do have suggestions about how we might start to think about gender and sex. It seems to me evident that gender and sex is part of an intimate structure of power in the everyday. It matters in how people are, how people behave. It matters down to its most intimate levels. The structuring of power around sex and gender is ecological, and it is also material, and that takes place in this everyday and in the micro-histories of households and communities. Such households and communities are networked and therefore connected in with wider power structures and wider intellectual structures. But the scene of structuration, the point at which that happens within a society, within a community, is always highly localized and highly precise. The ideologies of gender can be imperial, but gender and sex work locally. Humans, in my view, are profoundly social. It's one of our great gifts to be able to talk to each other. It's one of our great needs to be able to be with each other. Human society. I mean, when Aristotle talks about humans as the political animal, I think better to say that we are the social animal. Sex is a physiological, sociological, and relational characteristic of humans. And the multiplicity of sexes reflects the physiological and ecological complexity of human beings. The 1,000 different sexualities, the 1,000 different sexes is about our complexity, about our evolutionary difference, and about our wonderful multiplicity. And gender then becomes a highly imperfect cultural codification of individual complexity. To study this, I think we have to be local, we have to focus on the community, we have to focus on the household, we have to focus on the specific. But that's just a suggestion. And with that, I will stop sharing.